A flight attendant called the cops on a black boy over a seat issue, but when his dad stepped forward, the entire crew was left speechless. He thought calling security on a child would make him look powerful. He didn't realize the boy's father carried more authority than anyone on that aircraft. Subscribe if you believe respect should never depend on age or color. Ticket, please. The words dropped like stones in the quiet buzz of Gate 47. Kalen Maris looked up, startled, blinking beneath the brim of his navy cap. He had been sitting quietly, legs crossed and backpack hugged close to his chest, his eyes occasionally drifting to the digital screen listing departures. The boy straightened slightly, unsure if the voice was meant for him. It was. Standing just a few feet away, a white male flight attendant in a pressed uniform stared down at him. His name tag read R. Gray. His expression was sharp, not angry, but suspicious in a way that made Kalen instinctively tighten his grip on the backpack straps. The man's brows were drawn together as if the sight of a child in the priority boarding section didn't make sense, as if it didn't belong. Kalen offered the boarding pass with both hands, like it might prove his right to be there if he showed enough respect. "Here, sir," he said softly, his voice barely carrying above the low hum of boarding announcements. Rodell Gray took the ticket without a word and glanced at it with a scoff, turning it over slowly, as if searching for some hidden lie embedded in the ink. His eyes scanned it once, then again, and his lips pressed into a tight line. "Where did you get this?" he asked, voice rising just enough to draw glances from nearby passengers. Kalen blinked in confusion. "My dad booked it. He always—" Gray cut him off. "This barcode looks off. Could be a printing issue or something else." He held the pass higher, angling it toward the ceiling lights, though the scanner was just feet away. He didn't use it. Instead, he narrowed his eyes. "I'll need to verify this with security." "But," Kalen started, his words tripping over nerves. "It says Gate 47 and seat. Rules are rules," Gray snapped, folding the ticket in half and tucking it into the edge of his clipboard. "Stay here. I'll be back." He turned and walked away briskly without waiting for a response, his footsteps heavy against the tile floor. Kalen sat frozen, heart thudding in his chest. The moment had shifted so fast, from quiet waiting to public scrutiny. Around him, a few travelers turned to stare, their eyes flickering with curiosity or concern before they looked away again, unwilling to step in. The boy's face flushed with heat. He hadn't done anything wrong. The priority boarding tag had been printed right there on the pass. He had flown many times before, always alone, always careful. His father had drilled it into him. Be respectful, stay calm, don't draw attention. He tried to breathe slower, but the pressure behind his eyes made it hard. A sharp knot formed in his stomach. Not fear, exactly, but something close. Embarrassment tangled with helplessness. Kalen's fingers moved to his backpack zipper. He could show the email confirmation, the printed itinerary his father had packed into the front pocket. Maybe that would help. Maybe, don't. The word echoed in his memory. His dad's voice, calm but serious. If someone questions you, stay still. Don't reach into your bag unless they ask you to. So he didn't. He folded his hands in his lap and tried to sit up straighter, even though his shoulders ached with tension. He wished he had said his dad's name earlier. Maybe it would have helped. But when he tried, Rodell had dismissed him like a background noise. A few seats down, a middle-aged man in a business suit glanced up from his tablet, eyes narrowed in interest but not action. Another passenger, a younger guy with earbuds in, had pulled out his phone and was recording casually from behind a coffee cup. Kalen could feel their eyes, but not their support. The crowd watched. No one spoke. A voice on the loudspeaker called a boarding group, but it wasn't his yet. He wanted to vanish into the shuffle of footsteps and luggage wheels. Instead, he was stuck here, waiting, marked. He shifted in his seat, legs suddenly cold. The air conditioning from above hummed steadily, but the atmosphere around him had changed. The chair that once felt ordinary now felt too big, too exposed. He wasn't just a kid flying alone anymore. He was the center of someone else's doubt. His fingers clenched the fabric of his jeans as his mind ran through what his father might do. Would he call? Would he already know? His father always had a way of knowing things before they happened. Maybe this was one of those times. This isn't about the seat, he thought, his throat dry. It's about how he looked at me like I didn't belong here. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, unnoticed by most, but to Kaylin, everything felt amplified now. The crackle of the speaker, the murmurs from a couple across the aisle, the squeak of rolling suitcases, all of it layered over the silence he sat in. Rodell had said he was going to call security. Those words stuck like splinters. He'd done nothing wrong. But security would come anyway, and he was just a boy alone. Kaylin tried once more to speak up, looking toward the direction Rodell had gone, his voice barely audible. "My dad is Dorian Maris." But there was no one there to hear it. No one listening. Not yet. It was the moment he realized someone's assumptions could turn a quiet trip into a storm he never asked for. Officer Brant Corrin appeared beside Gate 47 with the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. His footsteps were heavy, clipped, and direct. His uniform freshly pressed, sunglasses still resting above his brow despite being indoors. The moment he stepped into view, the air shifted. Passengers glanced up, the way people do when something official arrives but don't yet know if it's danger or inconvenience. Rodell Gray motioned toward Kaylin without subtlety, his voice sharp with false urgency. "That's him," he said, pointing. "Kids trying to board with a flagged ticket." Brant's eyes locked on the boy, and without hesitation, he stepped forward until he stood directly in front of Kaylin. His shadow fell over the child like a drawn curtain. "On your feet," he ordered, his voice low but heavy with command. Kaylin blinked up at him, startled. Is something wrong?" His voice cracked slightly, not out of guilt, but confusion. The backpack on his lap shifted as he clutched it closer. Brant didn't answer the question. "Stand up. Now." The force in the officer's tone made a nearby woman flinch in her seat. A man across the aisle instinctively reached for his phone. Kaylin stood slowly, his hands trembling, legs unsure beneath him. He held out his boarding pass again, but Brant barely looked at it before waving it off. "There's a possible boarding violation. We'll need to verify your credentials. Come with me." "But I didn't," Kaylin began, but Brant stepped closer, towering over the boy. "You can explain at the checkpoint," Brant said. His words were clipped, his stance rigid, as if each syllable were part of a rehearsed script. He didn't look at Kaylin as a person, only as a problem to be moved. A soft murmur rippled through the waiting area. One man angled his phone to begin recording. A mother with 2 children leaned protectively forward, watching with growing unease. Kaylin looked from face to face but saw no one willing to intervene. Everyone was waiting, watching, judging, and none of them knew him. "My ticket's real," Kaylin tried again, his voice small. "I have the confirmation in my bag." At the mention of his bag, Brant's hand shot toward his belt, fingers brushing the holster at his side. "Slow," he warned. "Don't make sudden moves." Kaylin froze, eyes wide. His hand had barely moved toward the zipper when he realized the threat he'd just awakened. He looked up at Brant, shocked, tears stinging at the edges of his vision. I was going to show you." Rodell took a discreet step back, his earlier confidence wilting. He folded his arms and glanced away as if trying to detach himself from what he'd started. His lips were tight, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. The passengers watching didn't miss the shift in Brant's posture or the fear growing on Kaylin's face. Another phone rose into view. Whispered words floated across the gate area. "He's just a kid. That seems wrong. Why doesn't the officer check the ticket again?" But Brant didn't pause. "We're done here. Let's go." He reached out and gripped Kaylin's shoulder, not harshly, but firmly, enough to make it clear that resisting wasn't an option. Kaylin's throat tightened, his voice barely audible. "My dad said this could happen." Brant hesitated, just for a moment. His grip loosened by a fraction, and his eyes flickered toward the boy's face. That line, it wasn't a threat, it wasn't defiance, but it rang with a kind of truth that caught him off guard. "What did you say?" Brant asked, his tone less certain now. Kalen didn't answer. He looked away, blinking fast. The world was blurring at the edges, and his body felt heavier than it should. Brant stared at him a moment longer, then cleared his throat and resumed his grip. "We're going," he said again, more for the crowd than the boy. They began walking toward the side corridor, Brant leading, Kalen following in silence. The hallway ahead looked like it swallowed voices whole. The cameras kept rolling, but no one stepped forward to stop them. And just before the pair disappeared into the corridor's shadow, the boy's lip trembled, not from fear alone, but from the weight of being unheard. He wondered why the truth felt so silent when everyone else's judgment spoke so loudly. Brant's grip on Kalen's shoulder tightened as he began steering the boy away from Gate 47. The crowd's murmurs, the subtle flashes of phones recording, and the quiet hum of announcements over the intercom blurred into background noise as Kalen's sneakers shuffled against the polished floor. His breath came fast, shallow. Every step toward the dimly lit corridor felt heavier, like walking into a tunnel with no end. But just as they reached the metal threshold, a sharp ringtone shattered the air. The officer turned abruptly, eyes narrowing. Kalen glanced down. His phone vibrated wildly in his pocket. He knew that ringtone, his father's. He fumbled to grab it, but Brant's hand shot forward. "Give me that," the officer snapped, tone low but stern. "No," Kalen said, voice cracking. "It's my dad," he said to answer if anything happened. Brant paused, caught off guard. Behind them, several passengers leaned closer, holding up their phones. The tension in the hallway thickened. Kalen pressed the green icon, holding the phone to his ear with trembling fingers. "Dad?" A silence. Then a deep, calm voice filled the speaker. "Put the officer on." Brant's brows lifted, then drew together in suspicion. With a slight scoff, he plucked the phone from Kalen's hand. "This is Officer Brant Corin, Airport Secure." He stopped mid-sentence. His jaw stiffened. A second passed. Then another. His body, once squared with authority, subtly shifted, less firm, more respectful. "Yes, sir." "No, sir. I understand." He nodded as if saluting someone invisible, the edge in his voice vanishing with each word. Kalen, watching from below, felt his chest tighten in confusion and cautious hope. Rodell Gray, who had hovered just behind, stepped closer, whispering, "Who is it?" Brant didn't answer. His face had drained of color. When the call ended, he handed the phone back as if it carried voltage. "He's coming here," he muttered. The words came out flat, stunned. Kalen blinked. "What?" Brant's eyes scanned the terminal anxiously. His spine straightened like a soldier waiting for inspection. Around them, the passengers whispered louder now, sensing a shift they didn't fully understand. Kalen stared at the screen. The call had lasted only a minute, but everything had changed. And then, for the first time, he saw uncertainty flicker across Rodell's face too, like a man realizing he just kicked a door open he couldn't shut. For the first time, Kalen felt the storm turning back toward the men who started it. "Step away from my son." The voice cut through the hum of the terminal like a razor through fabric, low, calm, unmistakably firm. All heads turned toward Gate 47 as a sharply dressed man in a gray suit stepped into view, moving with the quiet force of someone who did not need to announce who he was. Dorian Maris didn't break stride. His coat caught a slight breeze as he walked, his expression unreadable but steady. In his eyes was not anger, but something colder. Precision. Authority. Officer Brant Corin, who had just begun mumbling something to a nearby gate staffer, snapped to attention. Rodell Gray froze mid-step, lips parted as if still trying to justify his actions. Neither man spoke as Dorian reached his destination. He said nothing to them at first. Instead, Dorian knelt beside Kalen. "Are you all right?" he asked. His voice softened but still edged with tension. His hand gently touched the boy's arm, eyes scanning his son for any signs of harm. Kalen nodded, but his face was pale, his grip tight around his backpack straps. Dorian held his gaze for a second longer, then rose to his full height. Now he turned toward the two men. "Explain," he said. Brant opened his mouth first, but Dorian raised a single hand, palm open. The gesture wasn't aggressive. It was a quiet command, the kind that made Brant's words die in his throat. "Officer," Dorian said slowly, "I didn't ask for theories. I asked for facts." Rodell tried to fill the silence. "Sir, the boarding pass had a strange barcode. I wasn't sure." "Strange," Dorian repeated, his voice level. "Show me the ticket." Kalen quickly handed it over. Dorian's eyes moved across the document, the faint green VIP stamp at the top right corner immediately catching his eye. He tilted it toward the light, reading the code aloud. Group 1. Priority boarding.
VPC Delta Clearance.
He looked up, locking eyes with Rodell. "Do you know what that clearance means?" Rodell swallowed hard. I didn't see that part clearly." "You didn't see it," Dorian repeated flatly. He turned the ticket so Brant could see it too. "Did you?" Brant hesitated, then muttered, "I acted on the staff's report." "And you chose to escort a 12-year-old child toward security before checking the confirmation email or scanning the pass a second time?" The silence thickened. Passengers nearby held their phones lower, but the recording still continued. Everyone was listening now. Dorian's gaze didn't shift. He pulled a slim black wallet from inside his coat and opened it, revealing an official identification badge. "I'm Dorian Maris, Senior Executive of National Operations for Skyrim Air. This pass was issued under my clearance. You threatened to remove my son based on assumptions." Rodell's legs visibly wobbled. His mouth opened, but only a choked sound escaped. Brant stepped back instinctively, suddenly realizing the depth of the mistake. The dramatic irony that had been building now cracked wide open, spilling into the space between them. Where once stood a quiet boy with no one listening, now stood a man whose voice could shake entire departments. Dorian didn't shout. He didn't posture. He simply lowered the ticket and spoke with clarity. "My son tried to tell you. You interrupted him." Rodell's hands twitched at his sides. "Sir, I didn't mean." "You did mean to question him. Loudly. Publicly." Dorian's words hit like small, methodical strikes. "You just didn't expect anyone important to be listening." Brant shifted uncomfortably. "It wasn't personal, sir." "But your badge made it feel personal," Dorian replied. A child who had done nothing wrong was treated like a problem. He glanced around now, acknowledging the stares of fellow passengers, their phones still trained in his direction. The tension was now inverted. Rodell and Brant no longer held control. Dorian did. A young staffer stepped closer but hesitated under Dorian's calm gaze. No need for backup. The damage had already been done. "Who is the gate manager on duty?" Dorian asked without raising his voice. Rodell blinked. Corvin Hale, sir." "Call him," Dorian said simply. There was no argument. Rodell turned shakily and radioed for Corvin, his voice stuttering through the static. Kalen, still seated nearby, watched his father with new eyes. Not because he was powerful, but because he never needed to prove it by yelling. Every word Dorian spoke cut through pride and excuse like a scalpel, precise, controlled, undeniable. And when Brant finally lowered his head slightly, perhaps realizing that no procedure manual could justify what had just happened, the balance had shifted completely. The silence around them wasn't awkward. It was respect, one earned not by fear, but by composure. Dorian turned to his son once more and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "I'm here now," he said, and Kalen nodded slowly. Behind them, the radio crackled with Corvin's reply, and the sound was carried across the boarding area like the start of something inevitable. The moment wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The man they dismissed as a boy's father was suddenly the one whose word could reshape all their futures. Dorian Maris didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He stepped slightly forward, the hush in the terminal thickening around him. "Mr. Gray," he said quietly, his tone exact. Why did you report a boarding violation without verifying the ticket properly? Rodell Gray, still gripping the small clipboard he had brought with him earlier, flinched at the question. The silence that followed was suffocating. Cameras continued recording from nearby passengers, and their screens reflected the tension back like mirrors in a courtroom. Rodell's throat bobbed as he forced a response. I acted out of caution, he stammered. The barcode looked suspicious. I thought it best to escalate just to be safe. Dorian's eyes didn't blink. The VIP code is printed clearly on the top right, he replied, tapping the boarding pass with his index finger. Bold, black, unmissable. That code identifies executive family travelers. It's the first thing a trained attendant is taught to recognize. Rodell's face paled. He looked down, pretending to study the pass now, as if seeing it for the first time. Around them, the boarding gate felt frozen in place. A toddler's cry echoed faintly from another corner of the terminal, but no one moved. All eyes were here. Without pause, Dorian turned toward Officer Brant Corin. The man straightened instinctively, chest rising like a shield. And you? Dorian asked, his voice even. You escorted my son away without checking his confirmation email? Without allowing him to explain. Brant's jaw twitched. I was following protocol. The staff called it in. Protocol doesn't mean abandon judgment, Dorian interrupted gently, but firmly. You're wearing a badge. That makes you accountable for more than just obedience. The officer's fingers curled at his sides. His voice faltered under the silent judgment of the crowd. He reached into his bag. I didn't know what he was pulling out. He was pulling out a piece of paper, Dorian replied. A confirmation printout. You reached for your holster. You didn't pause. You assumed. Dorian didn't yell. He didn't need to. The facts did all the shouting. Around them, the passengers continued recording, their expressions shifting from curious to horrified to quietly affirming. Some nodded, some murmured in agreement. The balance of power had tipped. Dramatic irony hung in the air. The two men who began this confrontation believing they were in control now stood exposed. Every word, every glance, every decision illuminated by the very public they once tried to command. Then, without turning his head, Dorian said, "Call the gate manager." The words landed like a gavel. Brant blinked. Rodell looked up in disbelief. Neither had expected the conversation to escalate with such clarity. Brant cleared his throat, muttered something into his radio. Within moments, another voice crackled back with a confirmation. The gate manager was en route. While they waited, Dorian knelt beside Kalen again, speaking in a low voice that no one else could hear. The boy nodded, his shoulders easing slightly. When Dorian stood again, his gaze didn't waver. The silence, thick and fragile, held until the gate manager arrived. Corvin Hale, the manager, stepped into view, a tall man in a dark vest and blue lanyard, his salt and pepper hair combed sharply to the side. He looked around at the gathered crowd, at the two uniformed men standing stiff and pale, and then at Dorian, who stood poised, still holding his son's boarding pass like it was an exhibit in a trial. "What's going on here?" Corvin asked, voice low but clipped. Dorian didn't speak immediately. Instead, he held out the ticket. "Mr. Hale, would you please take a look at this pass and tell me if anything is out of place?" Corvin stepped forward, taking the pass. His eyes scanned it. Then they narrowed. "That's a VIP code," he muttered. "Valid for executive family. Fully cleared." Dorian nodded. "And would you expect that to be recognized by your staff?" "Yes, absolutely," Corvin answered without hesitation. "Any trained team member would spot that right away." Dorian tilted his head toward Rodell. "Then we have a problem." Rodell opened his mouth. "Sir, I thought—" Corvin raised a hand. "Stop." The command was calm but absolute. "I need to know exactly what happened," Corvin said, turning to Kalen. "From your perspective." The boy swallowed, then spoke. His voice was quiet but steady. "He said my ticket looked suspicious. I gave it to him, but he said he was calling security. He didn't scan it again. He didn't let me explain. Then the officer came, I tried to show my confirmation email, but he stopped me. He put his hand on his holster, and I got scared. That's when I said my dad told me to answer if he called. Corvin's eyes remained fixed on Kalen the whole time. When the boy finished, he exhaled slowly, jaw tight. Then came the twist. Corvin straightened and looked at Dorian. Mr. Maris, I should tell you something. This isn't the first complaint we've received about Mr. Gray. He gestured at Rodell, who froze. There have been 3 others this year. Passengers alleging improper treatment at the gate. We filed them, but no action was taken. Brant stepped back slightly, no longer wanting to share space with Rodell. Dorian simply nodded once, slowly. I see. The weight of it all pressed on the crowd. He turned to Kalen and placed a hand on his shoulder. You did everything right, he said, voice low but strong. You stayed calm. You followed instructions. You didn't raise your voice. You remembered what we talked about. The boy nodded, and for the first time, a flicker of relief passed over his face. His spine straightened just a little more. Dorian looked at no one else. He didn't need to. The silence, the cameras, the shame on the faces of the 2 men who had started all of this. They told the story now. He hadn't needed to raise his voice. He had chosen truth over noise. And now the scene was shifting. In that moment, everyone realized the calmest man in the room was the one holding all the power. Corvin Hale stepped forward the moment he heard the raised voices, his expression tightening as he observed the tense semicircle forming around Dorian and Kalen. The atmosphere around Gate 47 felt heavier than the chatter of a typical boarding area. Corvin's tired eyes sharpened with focus as he stopped between the 2 groups and said, Someone explain what happened. His tone, though calm, carried the authority of someone who had seen too many conflicts trimmed down to excuses. Rodell opened his mouth immediately, taking a quick step forward as if rushing to control the narrative. Sir, the passenger, the child, was sitting in the wrong section. His ticket seemed. Corvin lifted a firm hand, stopping him mid-sentence without even looking in his direction. I asked for an explanation, he said. Not an interruption. Kalen, you tell me what happened. The shift was immediate. Rodell's jaw clicked shut, and the surrounding passengers leaned in as though someone had just pulled the curtain open on the truth. Kalen swallowed, his small hands gripping the straps of his backpack like a lifeline. He lifted his head slowly, still shaken, but determined to speak. I was just sitting where my ticket said. The boy began softly. His voice trembled, but his words were careful, almost painfully precise. He came over and said my ticket looked suspicious. I gave it to him. He didn't scan it again. He just said he needed to call security. I tried to explain, but he kept talking over me. Corvin's gaze didn't move from Kalen. His posture stiffened as each detail settled into place. The crowd's silence grew, heavy and expectant. Rodell shifted nervously, trying again to defend himself. Sir, with respect, the barcode. The VIP code is printed in bold across the top. Corvin cut in, finally turning his eyes on the flight attendant. His voice had sharpened, losing its earlier neutrality. Any trained staff member should recognize it immediately. You didn't need security. You needed to scan the ticket properly. Brant stepped forward this time, trying to shift the blame with a straightened back and a rehearsed tone. He misled me, Brant said, pointing at Rodell with a stiff motion. He said the boy wasn't cooperating. I responded based on the information I was given. Dorian looked at Brant with a calmness that somehow felt louder than anger. A uniform is a responsibility, he said quietly, not an excuse. His voice struck the air with a quiet authority, and even the passengers felt the weight of the words settling between the men. Corvin exhaled slowly, rubbing his forehead as if bracing for what would come next. This will have to go in an official report, he muttered, shaking his head. His tone hinted that the issue was far larger than a simple misunderstanding. But before he could say more, a voice from the left interrupted. I recorded the whole thing, a male passenger said, stepping forward cautiously. Another stepped beside him, holding up his phone. So did I. We saw everything. A ripple moved through the crowd, surprise, relief, and something close to justice. One by one, two more male passengers approached, each offering to provide statements and footage. Corvin's breath hitched for a moment. The situation was transforming in real time, from a minor complaint to a public record supported by multiple witnesses. His eyes darted between the phones, the officers, and Dorian, realizing the weight of what he was now responsible for. Rodell's confidence visibly collapsed. His shoulders caved inward, his hands twitching at his sides, as if searching for an excuse that no longer existed. Brant's face lost its earlier firmness. He looked suddenly smaller in his deep blue uniform, the responsibility he'd spoken of just moments ago now hanging heavily over him. Through all of this, Dorian did not raise his voice or make a single dramatic gesture. He simply placed a steady hand on Kalen's shoulder, grounding him in the middle of the unfolding storm. His calmness drew the attention of the crowd even more than the conflict had. Corvin finally took a deep breath, his voice low and steady as he said, "All right. This is no longer just a misunderstanding." He looked toward his staff with a disappointment that hit harder than anger. "We're going to handle this properly." Around them, the space felt like a held breath. Gate 47 had become a quiet stage where excuses dissolved faster than they could be spoken. And with each new witness stepping forward, the truth became sharper, clearer, impossible to bury. Rodell's gaze dropped to the floor. Brant's eyes flickered with uncertainty. Only Dorian and Kalen stood with clarity, one as steady as stone, the other finally beginning to breathe again. The moment hung, suspended in a fragile balance, as if waiting for the final verdict. The more the truth came out, the smaller the excuses began to sound. Corvin Hale had barely finished instructing Rodell and Brant to follow him toward the operations office when a sharp voice cut through the low murmur of the gate area. "Hold a moment," said a uniformed officer stepping briskly into the scene. All eyes turned. The man was taller than Brant, dressed in a slightly more formal version of the security uniform, with polished boots and a clean silver pin that gleamed against his chest. His name tag read D. Verrick, and his expression was calm but unreadable. He carried a tablet in one hand and moved with the confidence of someone who knew both procedure and power. He walked straight toward Dorian without even acknowledging Brant or Rodell. "Mr. Maris?" he asked, voice low but steady.
I'm Officer Dane Verrick.
"I need to confirm something with you immediately." Dorian, standing with one hand resting lightly on Kalen's shoulder, gave a single nod. "Go ahead." Dane brought up the display on his device and tilted it so only Dorian could see. "We received an alert from Central Monitoring. A VIP child escort protocol was pinged from this gate. That alert comes with a red flag notice, triggered when flag tickets assigned to corporate-level dependents are mishandled." Brant's head snapped around. "Wait, what alert? That system's not public access." Dane turned slowly, facing Brant for the first time. His calm expression hardened. "Correct. It isn't public. But your actions made it public." Brant's face paled slightly. His mouth opened as if to respond, but no sound came. Dane scanned the ticket barcode again, cross-referencing Kalen's information. The screen pulsed once in confirmation. Then Dane let out a low breath and stared directly at Brant. "You detained the son of the man who oversees half our national fleet operations?" The words were quiet, but they cracked like thunder. Gasps spread across the waiting area like ripples in water. Some passengers looked from Kalen to Dorian with sudden realization. Others turned their phones back on, fingers ready to document what came next. Brant's posture stiffened. His throat moved in a heavy swallow, and he took one small step back. Rodell's legs buckled slightly, and he gripped the wall rail behind him as if the room had tilted. Dorian didn't gloat. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he placed a hand on Kalen's back, gently reassuring the boy without needing words. Officer Dane turned to Dorian again, the authority now entirely in the executive's hands. "Sir, how would you like us to proceed?" The question wasn't procedural, it was deferential. It was the kind of question asked to someone whose voice could reroute careers. Dorian didn't answer immediately. He glanced at Kalen, who looked up at him, eyes wide but calm. Then he spoke, his voice composed and quiet but strong enough for all to hear. My priority is that my son boards safely and without any further disruption. But this incident must be reviewed. Thoroughly. Later. Internally. Dane nodded once, understanding the signal, firm but not retaliatory. Understood. He looked back at Corvin, who, now visibly shaken by how far the situation had escalated, gave a curt nod and began typing rapidly into his tablet. The atmosphere shifted again, no longer chaotic, no longer merely tense. A verdict had silently passed. The power dynamic was no longer uncertain. Passengers whispered. Phones were still up, still recording, but now less for justice and more for the sheer shock of witnessing a reversal so absolute. Rodell's mouth opened once more, but no words formed. His face had gone an ashen gray. Brant stood stiffly, staring straight ahead as if trying to disappear into the air around him. Kalen looked around and saw something change, not just in the people around him, but in how they looked at him. Not with pity, but with recognition. Respect, even. As Dane gave final instructions for Rodell and Brant to be taken to the operations office, he remained beside Dorian with professional calm. I'll stay here until your boarding begins, he said, just to ensure everything proceeds without interference. Dorian gave a nod of appreciation. A few steps away, a man in a business suit whispered to his seatmate. The moment someone who knew the truth arrived, the entire atmosphere changed like a storm turning toward the sea. He pointed at the boy, demanding security remove him, as passengers held their breath. If you believe power misused is power lost, hit subscribe now. Because dignity always flies higher than arrogance. Dorian led Kalen back to the seating area, his hand steady on his son's back, guiding him through the quiet corridor of curious eyes and hushed murmurs. Behind them, Officer Brant Corrin and Flight Attendant Rodell Gray were being escorted by security, their postures hunched under the weight of their own decisions. But Dorian's focus was unwavering. His son came first. He stopped near the row of seats Kalen had been pulled from and knelt once more, lowering himself to eye level. Kalen blinked fast, trying to suppress the mixture of confusion and shame that had crept across his face. You did nothing wrong, Dorian said, his voice calm but edged with certainty. You held your ground. I'm proud of you. Kalen nodded, though his hands remained clenched in his lap. Did I mess things up? No, Dorian answered quickly. The truth did all the work. Let it keep doing it. Before Kalen could respond, a nervous cough broke through the tension. A young man in a slim navy suit stepped into view, clutching a black tablet against his chest like a fragile shield. He had short, neat hair, a fresh face, and the unmistakable posture of someone tasked with something far above his pay grade. Mr. Maris? He asked, glancing around as if hoping someone else might claim the name. Dorian stood slowly, eyes narrowing with quiet curiosity. Yes, I'm Jaren Voss, the man said, adjusting his tie. I've been sent by corporate. There's been a directive. From HQ, they've requested a real-time status briefing. Remote link. Here. Now. Kalen looked up, puzzled. Dorian's expression remained unreadable, but a flicker passed through his eyes, an awareness that this incident had already rippled beyond this terminal. Jaren tapped the side of the tablet and turned it toward them. A glowing emblem flashed onto the screen, Skyrim Air's headquarters interface, secured and marked urgent. Passengers nearby leaned forward slightly, sensing the shift. The drama had not ended. It was evolving. We've been asked to initiate a secure conference with 2 senior executives, Jaren added. Your name? It triggered a Tier 1 flag in our chain of command. Dorian glanced down at Kalen, whose brow furrowed with worry. Did I make this worse? The boy whispered. You didn't make anything worse, Dorian replied, kneeling again briefly. You made sure they saw what needed to be seen. He stood and faced the screen. Go ahead, he told Jaren. The tablet flickered once, then split into 2 live video feeds. On one side was a sharply dressed man with gray hair and deep lines across his forehead, Marcel Cade, Executive Director of Airline Operations. On the other, a bespectacled, quiet-eyed man in a sterile office, Orion Bryn, Corporate Risk and Policy Compliance Lead. Mr. Maris, Marcel began, his tone courteous but firm. We understand there's been a serious breach in protocol. Dorian's hands folded calmly behind his back. That's one way to describe it. We'd appreciate a complete walkthrough, Orion added, already typing into a secure log visible in the corner of his screen. From your perspective, passengers shifted in their seats, trying not to look like they were eavesdropping, though the intensity of the scene made it impossible not to. Dorian's tone remained measured, but his words were laced with intent. Your staff detained my son without verifying his ticket. They ignored the VIP code printed clearly on it. They refused to check the confirmation email. They involved security instead of simply using a scanner. The officer who responded threatened escalation before asking a single question. And this, he paused, gesturing at Kalen, is a 12-year-old boy who did everything by the book. Marcel exhaled slowly, nodding as he absorbed each word. Orion continued typing, his brow furrowed in concentration. Was there any provocation on your son's part? Marcel asked carefully. Only the provocation of sitting quietly in the seat assigned to him, Dorian replied, unblinking. Jaren looked from face to face, clearly stunned by the gravity in the air. Even Kalen sensed the energy. This wasn't just a complaint anymore. This was oversight. This was consequence. We've reviewed the staff logs, Orion said after a pause. The flight attendant, Rodell Gray, has had prior concerns flagged. Nothing substantial until now. And the officer? Dorian asked. Officer Corrin failed a recent youth interaction protocol. He shouldn't have responded to this without supervision, Orion admitted. That failure is now documented. Dramatic irony hung thick in the air. The same men who wielded authority so confidently minutes ago had been teetering on the edge without realizing it. I'm not asking for punishments, Dorian said, his voice softening slightly, but I am demanding improvement. This kind of judgment, it can harm more than it protects. Marcel nodded solemnly. Understood. One final thing, Mr. Maris. You submitted a proposal last quarter for a verification first protocol. At the time, it was shelved due to resource concerns. But in light of this, he looked at Orion, who gave a small nod. We'd like to activate it immediately, with your name attached. Kalen blinked. Wait. Because of this? Dorian looked down at his son, and for the first time that day, a faint smile broke through the lines of control on his face. Because you stayed calm when others didn't, he said. Around them, passengers whispered quietly. The father and son were no longer just travelers. They were the catalyst for change. Marcel concluded the call with a nod. We'll follow up within 24 hours. Thank you, Mr. Maris. Thank you, Kalen. The screen went dark. Jaren tapped the tablet off, holding it gently as if it had become something sacred. Kalen exhaled slowly, still absorbing everything. His shoulders had relaxed just slightly. Ready to board when called, Dorian said, his voice steady once more. And just like that, the moment settled. What began as a misunderstanding was turning into a lesson the entire airline would remember. The tablet screen glowed with a faint hum as the secure call connected. Dorian Maris sat straight-backed beside his son in the quiet alcove near Gate 47. The boarding area still buzzing faintly behind the plexiglass barrier. The mood was tense. Jaren Voss stood nearby, fidgeting with the stylus in his left hand, while Kalen leaned slightly into his father's side, not quite sure what to expect from the live call corporate had demanded. Two faces blinked onto the screen, sharp, serious, and lit from the cold fluorescence of what looked like a glass-walled executive room. The first was Marcel Cade, his expression unreadable except for the subtle crease between his brows. Beside him sat Orion Bryn, younger but equally alert, his fingers already hovering over a digital notepad. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was deliberate, controlled. Power was being measured, not wasted. Mr. Maris, Marcel began, voice firm but respectful. We appreciate your willingness to speak under these circumstances. Orion is logging this call. We'd like a complete recounting, from your perspective. Dorian gave a small nod. He didn't clear his throat, didn't stall. He began with precision, voice low and steady. My son, Kalen, arrived at the gate early. He was seated in the designated VIP boarding section when he was approached by a flight attendant, Rodell Gray, who questioned the validity of his ticket without scanning it again. Despite Kalen showing a printed boarding pass with a verified VIP code, the attendant accused him of boarding fraud and called airport security. Officer Brant Corin responded, escalated the matter without confirmation, and physically attempted to escort my son out of the gate area. Dorian's jaw flexed just slightly as he continued. When Kalen called me, per my instructions in case anything like this ever happened, I asked Officer Corin to pause and verify. He refused. I arrived minutes later and found my son humiliated, frightened, and already documented as a boarding violator without any evidence. Jaren shifted beside them, face pale. Marcel didn't interrupt. He simply glanced at Orion, who typed rapidly. Then he leaned forward. We reviewed the initial incident logs, Marcel said, voice now edged with something sharper than neutrality. But we hadn't yet heard the precise phrasing you just used. You're saying Officer Corin and Attendant Gray escalated without any secondary verification. Dorian's reply was direct. Correct. No one scanned the pass a second time. No one asked him a follow-up question. They moved to detain him before confirming basic information. Kalen looked down, his fists lightly clenched in his lap. Dorian placed a hand gently on the boy's back. That was when the twist dropped, quiet, sudden, and waited. Marcel cleared his throat. Then it's important you know something. Rodell Gray was already on a performance watch list. He's had 3 prior complaints for mishandling passenger interactions, 2 of them involving minors, and had been placed on behavioral observation status. Orion added without lifting his eyes. And Officer Corin failed his last de-escalation training, specifically in youth interaction protocols. His recertification was contingent on supervision during incident response, which, clearly, did not happen today. Jaren froze. The realization settled like a fog in the air. The very men who had acted with such misplaced confidence were already under scrutiny, hollow giants unaware their foundation had been crumbling beneath them. Kalen looked up at his father, confusion in his eyes. They weren't even supposed to do that? No, Dorian said softly, not looking away from the screen. They weren't. Marcel exhaled, then leaned back slowly. Given your position, Mr. Maris, I'm assuming you're considering filing an internal grievance or possibly legal recourse. Dorian didn't blink. I'm not looking to punish individuals for the sake of headlines. I want something changed. My son followed every rule. And still, he was treated like a threat. Orion finally looked up. And what would you propose? Dorian didn't hesitate. Enforce the protocol I submitted last year, verification first. Before calling security, before accusation, staff must scan, verify, and cross-check a traveler's status through the Skyrim internal system. It was designed to prevent moments like this. It was shelved due to concerns about rollout cost and training fatigue. This proves those excuses cost more. Silence again. But this time it was Marcel and Orion who wore the thoughtful looks. We remember that proposal, Orion said slowly. It was thorough. Marcel looked toward the edge of his screen, likely at a staffer just off camera, and murmured something muted. Then he turned back. You're right, and I'm going to say it plainly, we're pushing the implementation forward. Today. No more delays. Jaren blinked in surprise, stunned at how quickly the wheels were turning. Dorian gave only a slow nod. Then something good can come from this. Orion tapped a few final notes. We'll name it formally and issue rollout memos by morning. But the system will now require double verification before any youth-related incident can be escalated to security. Your son's ticket, for example, should have stopped this whole event before it began. A long pause followed as everyone digested that. Then, almost as an afterthought, Marcel glanced to the side and said, "There's one more thing. Mr. Maris, your restraint today, your composure, is not lost on us. You could have taken this to the media immediately. Instead, you walked through the process. That matters." Dorian offered a faint but firm response. "My son was watching, and how I handle this teaches him what real accountability looks like." The executives nodded slowly. Near the seating row, a few passengers still lingered, watching, whispering to one another as bits of the conversation floated past. A man in a blue jacket leaned to a woman beside him and muttered, "That boy just changed how this whole airline works." As the call ended and the screen dimmed, Jaren still stood silently, the stylus limp in his hand. Kalen looked up at his father, not with fear now, but with something closer to awe. It wasn't the loudest man in the room who changed everything. It was the one who never raised his voice. Even Kalen realized that sometimes the smallest voice can start the biggest corrections. Captain Laron Skade arrived with the weight of urgency trailing every step. His boots struck the terminal floor with a deliberate rhythm, his eyes scanning the boarding area until they locked onto Dorian Maris. In his hand, he clutched a printed report, edges slightly crumpled as if it had been gripped too tightly during a fast walk. His expression was tight, somewhere between discomfort and duty. "Mr. Maris?" Laron said, slightly breathless but firm. "I need to speak with you immediately." Dorian turned slowly, the quiet authority in his posture unchanged. Kalen, standing just behind him, instinctively reached for his father's hand, not out of fear, but because the moment felt unfamiliar again, like the calm was about to be stirred once more. Laron didn't wait for an invitation. "Officer Brant Corin has submitted a formal statement claiming your son displayed suspicious behavior at the gate, enough to warrant detainment." The sentence cut through the hum of the terminal. Jaren Voss, who had been standing beside Dorian, stiffened visibly. Passengers nearby turned their heads again. The tension that had just begun to dissolve now simmered with new life. Dorian's brow furrowed. "And," Captain Skade raised the paper in his hand, "and the surveillance footage proves every part of that claim false." For a heartbeat, no one moved. "The footage," Laron continued, his voice gaining strength, "shows your son calmly sitting in the priority section with a valid ticket in hand. There was no evasive movement, no refusal, no provocation. It was Rodell who initiated the confrontation, and Brant who escalated it without verifying anything." Dramatic irony swept through the air like a cold wind. Brant had assumed the camera would shield him, support his version. He hadn't expected it to betray him. Laron's expression changed, softening slightly as he glanced at Kalen. "Mr. Maris, I've also come to personally apologize. On behalf of airport security." Dorian didn't nod. He simply studied Laron for a moment, reading not just his words but his restraint. "And Brant?" he asked. Laron hesitated, then answered with careful precision. "He's been under internal review for a pattern of overstepping authority. Nothing this public until now. But after what the footage revealed, and the number of passengers offering corroborating statements, he's been suspended pending full review. Effective immediately." The terminal grew quieter. Passengers stopped pretending not to listen. Some even moved closer, as if proximity would make justice more real. Laron added, "As for flight attendant Rodell Gray, his actions violated verification protocol. He'll be handled at the corporate level. The incident's already been escalated beyond our department." Kalen blinked, a slow realization settling in. None of this was his fault. He had done nothing wrong, and now others were finally saying it out loud. Jaren's face turned pale. "Captain," he said quietly, "did Brant really believe that would stand up in front of surveillance?" Laron exhaled sharply through his nose. "Some people think the badge protects them more than it does. Until the tape speaks." Dorian glanced at Kalen, then returned his gaze to Laron. His voice remained calm, unshaken. "Accountability should never be driven by emotion. It should be anchored in fact." Those nearby murmured in agreement. One older man standing near the gate leaned in and whispered to his wife, He never raised his voice. Not once. But he just brought the whole house down. The footage was not shown to the public, but its contents traveled in whispers and fragments, replayed through the eyes of those who had seen how the scene unfolded and how it finally unraveled. Passengers who had recorded bits of the incident now held their phones differently, not as tools of outrage, but as witnesses to a lesson they hadn't expected to see. That calm could be stronger than anger, and truth could rise without shouting. Jaron tapped something into his tablet, likely submitting a status update to corporate headquarters, while Captain Skade collected his report and prepared to step away. "Thank you for your time," Laron said, with a respectful nod toward Dorian. "You'll be informed when the full report is closed." As he walked away, the weight he had carried on arrival seemed to shift to those left behind, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. The responsibility to remember what had happened here, what had almost gone unquestioned. Dorian placed a hand gently on Kalen's shoulder. "Let's sit for a moment," he said quietly. Kalen nodded, glancing around at the passengers who now looked at him with something new in their eyes. Not pity, not judgment, but respect. Jaron remained close, saying little, unsure if anything more needed to be said. And for the first time since the whole ordeal began, the air felt different. Less like a stage of accusation, more like a space where truth had been allowed to stand. The moment the cameras spoke, every false word lost its power. Kalen stepped forward slowly, one foot onto the jet bridge, then paused. The voices behind him, soft announcements, murmurs from passengers, blurred into a hush. Something about walking through that tunnel alone made his chest tighten, not with fear exactly, but with the weight of everything that had just happened. He had been pushed, doubted, and nearly removed, all for sitting in the seat he was assigned. Now, even with his father beside him, the echoes of judgment lingered. Halfway down the jet bridge, the sound of brisk footsteps caught his attention. "Mr. Maris?" came a voice, calm but purposeful. Dorian turned just as Officer Dane Verrick approached from the terminal. Unlike the stern Brant Corin, Dane's expression was respectful, alert but not forceful. In his hand was a folded sheet of paper, a communication slip bearing the Skyrim insignia in dark blue. "There's been a directive from senior leadership," Dane said, stopping just before them. "They've requested you and your son be escorted directly to the flight deck. The captain would like to speak with you personally before takeoff." Kalen blinked, confused. "The cockpit?" he asked softly, glancing up at his father. Dorian gave a brief nod, calm but unreadable. "Let's hear what he has to say." They walked together, the three of them moving down the jet bridge with quiet momentum. As they reached the aircraft entrance, a tall man in a navy blue pilot uniform stepped forward. His sleeves bore 3 gold stripes, and a laminated ID badge read, "Captain Jorin Reddick." "Mr. Maris," Jorin said, offering a firm handshake. "And you must be Kalen." Kalen nodded slowly, eyes flicking between the captain's kind gaze and the glowing controls visible just behind him. "I wanted to meet you both personally," Jorin continued, ushering them into the cockpit. "I received a priority alert from operations during pre-flight. Not a common occurrence." The cockpit was smaller than Kalen expected, a tight space glowing with blinking lights and digital panels. 2 flight officers sat quietly in their seats, monitoring checklists, but both turned slightly to acknowledge the visitors. The space smelled faintly of cool plastic and machine oil, like something important had been happening even before they entered. Jorin motioned for them to step closer. "You were flagged on the internal VIP watch because of a passenger interference incident. That's a rare alert. We only get them when protocol is seriously violated." Dorian didn't respond immediately. His eyes studied the controls, the alert panel above the dash, and then finally settled on the captain's expression. "My son was challenged over a valid seat," Dorian said evenly. "Escalated without a second glance. No one verified the code. Security was called. He was treated like a threat." Captain Reddick's face darkened slightly. "I've read the preliminary report. Honestly, I wish I could say I was surprised, but it shouldn't have happened. Wishing isn't the same as correcting, Dorian replied. I'm not here to make this about special treatment. I'm here because what happened to my son shouldn't happen to anyone's child. We need better judgment before escalation. Better training. Empathy with structure. Kalen listened, his gaze drifting over the glowing instruments as if they whispered secrets older than arguments. This wasn't how he imagined a cockpit would feel. Not like a reward. Not like a peek behind a curtain. Felt serious, like stepping into a room where real decisions got made. Jorin let out a breath and nodded slowly. I understand, and I respect that. I've already logged a priority incident memo, and once we're airborne, I'll file a supplemental report myself. One that emphasizes compassion before confrontation, verification before escalation. Dorian offered a subtle nod of appreciation. That's all I ask. Fix it for the next child. There was a brief silence, not awkward but respectful. Jorin glanced down at Kalen, who met his gaze more confidently now. I hope this flight restores a bit of faith, Jorin said gently. It's not about the flight, Kalen replied. It's about being seen the first time. That made Jorin pause. After a few more quiet exchanges, Jorin stepped aside and offered his hand again. Thank you both. I'll make sure your message reaches the right people. They stepped out of the cockpit, the door closing behind them with a soft pneumatic hiss. Kalen walked a little taller this time, his father beside him, not because the fear was gone, but because it had been answered with truth. The cockpit felt less like a reward and more like a reminder that dignity always flies highest. The soft chime of the overhead intercom interrupted the quiet hum of the aircraft. Mr. Dorian Maris, please make your way to the flight deck. The captain's voice echoed calmly but firmly through the cabin. Kalen turned his head sharply, his heart skipping. He looked at his father, who met his eyes with a composed nod. No words were exchanged. Dorian rose from his seat with the same steady grace that had silenced a crowd earlier, adjusted the collar of his blazer, and walked toward the front of the aircraft. The aisle narrowed around him, but his steps never wavered. Passengers who had witnessed the earlier incident watched him pass, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and respect. The cockpit door opened before he reached it, and Captain Jorin Reddick stood waiting. The captain stepped aside and gestured for him to enter. Inside, the cockpit buzzed with quiet instrumentation. Screens glowed with blue and green readouts. Knobs and switches lined the panels, and the scent of metal and air conditioning lingered faintly. Captain Reddick shut the door behind them and turned, his expression more solemn than before. Mr. Maris, he said, voice lowered. I just received a direct dispatch from corporate. Dorian didn't speak. He merely tilted his head slightly, encouraging the captain to continue. Following the internal review triggered by your son's boarding flag and the witness footage we forwarded, Reddick said, carefully measuring his tone. Rodell Gray has been formally removed from duty, effective immediately, and Officer Brant Corin's suspension has been escalated to a mandatory review panel by airport oversight. He paused, watching for any sign of satisfaction in Dorian's face. But none came. Dorian's jaw remained still, his expression unreadable, eyes locked on the far side of the cockpit as though absorbing the weight of the moment. The decision came down fast, Jorin added, because of the overwhelming statements provided by passengers and the clarity of the surveillance footage. Headquarters didn't wait. Dorian finally spoke, his voice low and measured. I appreciate the update, Captain, but you should know I didn't want this to become about punishment. Not for spectacle. I asked for change. I understand that, sir, Jorin said, nodding with quiet respect. But I also believe accountability clears the path for real change. That's what this looks like to me. Dorian took a slow breath. His shoulders eased slightly, not from triumph but from the pressure he'd been holding ever since the first accusation was thrown at his son. It's never just about this one flight, he said quietly. It's about every child who might sit in that chair tomorrow, facing a question they shouldn't have to answer. Jorin looked down at the flight log momentarily, as if to process the gravity of what had just been said. Then he looked back up. You're right, And I'll make sure this gets written into the report, not just the actions that were taken, but why they had to be. Dorian nodded once. He turned to leave but stopped as the cockpit door opened. The captain's co-pilot gave him a silent nod of acknowledgement, one that carried more weight than words. Dorian returned it briefly before stepping out. Back in the cabin, the air felt different. Kalen watched as his father returned, eyes alert. Dorian's walk was a fraction slower now, as if each step gave him time to process not just what happened but what it might mean later. When he reached his seat and sat down, Kalen leaned in instinctively. "What did he say?" Kalen asked in a quiet voice. Dorian looked at him for a moment, and for the first time since the confrontation began, something softened in his face. Not relief exactly, but something gentler, like the tide after a storm. "They handled it," he said simply. "It's being taken seriously now." Kalen didn't respond right away. He just nodded, sinking back into his seat and pulling the seatbelt tighter across his lap. The hum of the plane filled the silence between them. Out the window, clouds passed like silent witnesses. A few rows behind them, a passenger who had recorded the earlier incident glanced forward and caught Dorian's eye. He gave a small, respectful nod. Dorian returned it, then looked at his son, who was watching him closely now. "You okay?" he asked. Kalen hesitated. "Yeah," he said. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how everything flipped," Kalen murmured. They started with the loudest voices, but none of them knew who they were even talking to. Dorian gave a quiet hum of agreement. "Sometimes people speak before they see. That's why we have to stay steady. Not silent, just steady." Kalen absorbed that. He didn't always understand his father's way of doing things, but today he had seen the full picture. The restraint, the force that didn't need to shout. He looked out the window again. The clouds were glowing now, kissed with light from above, endless and calm. Passengers settled in, flight attendants moved with quiet respect, and the overhead lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft entered a cruising altitude. And in that small, rare pocket of peace, Dorian leaned his head back, not to sleep, but to think. The silence wasn't hollow. It was earned. Passengers who earlier watched the conflict now recognized Dorian as a figure who uses calm, not anger, to restore fairness. On a plane thousands of feet in the air, the truth rose even higher. Weeks later, the footage from Gate 47 still circulates online, not for sensationalism, but as a quiet, powerful example of justice done right. The once-rising storm that surrounded 12-year-old Kalen Maris has begun to settle, but its echoes continue to reshape the very ground it swept through. Inside a high-rise glass office at Skyron Air Headquarters, the new Verification First protocol is being formally introduced to department heads across the country. The name, etched into the top of every document and training module, draws from a single moment, the one where no one verified Kalen's ticket before calling security. The corporate rollout includes case studies, retraining courses, and internal memos urging staff to prioritize verification before action. And while the policy is sweeping, its inspiration is singular. Dorian Maris stands at the front of a corporate training seminar weeks after the incident. He's not here to speak as a victim's parent or even as a senior executive. He's here because they asked him to explain how a silent assumption nearly dismantled a child's sense of safety. The room is full of supervisors and flight crew managers, each holding a training tablet, but it's Dorian's quiet voice that fills the space more than any slide. "It wasn't just the lack of verification," he says, hands lightly resting on the podium. "It was the refusal to listen when someone tried to speak up. My son wasn't just challenged, he was ignored. His words are not bitter, but deliberate. Every pause is a window into how he chooses clarity over anger. The audience listens not out of obligation, but respect." Dorian doesn't ask for apologies. He asks for change. Outside the conference, Kalen avoids the spotlight. He returns to school and his routine, but he walks differently now, not with arrogance, but with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. On his nightstand rests a copy of the updated boarding pass format, the VIP code now color-coded and triple-bolded. It had been redesigned based on his experience. At home, Kalen occasionally scrolls through the videos posted by passengers from that day. Some of the videos have millions of views, but what stands out aren't the numbers. It's the comments. People don't praise outrage. They praise composure, dignity, the restraint his father showed, the calm in Kalen's eyes even when treated unfairly. Then, unexpectedly, Corvin Hale, the former gate manager, reaches out. His message arrives through official channels but is deeply personal. "I just wanted to say thank you." Corvin's voice crackles through a scheduled video call. "Not just for what you said that day, but how you said it. It changed the way I manage people." He explains that after the incident, he applied for a new supervisory role centered on ethics and conduct oversight. To his surprise, he got it. He attributes it directly to the way the Maris incident reshaped company expectations. "Before, no one knew how close we were to the edge. That day made sure we never fall off it again." Dorian listens quietly, nodding once. "That day showed a lot of people who they were. It gave us the chance to decide who we want to be next." Meanwhile, updates come in regularly from the airline's internal affairs office. Brant Corin, the officer who escalated the event without review, has entered a corrective action program. His suspension remains in place until further psychological evaluations are completed. Rodell Gray, the flight attendant, has been removed from duty indefinitely and is undergoing a formal investigation. Whether either man returns to frontline duty remains uncertain, but one thing is clear: their actions will not be forgotten or repeated. What matters more, however, is the shift happening around them. A new generation of training modules now includes a case simulation titled Gate 47 Incident, with Kalen's experience becoming part of onboarding discussions across the company. Role-play scenarios, emotional recognition drills, and decision tree analyses are now mandatory, and Dorian's words, calm, firm, undeniable, play as part of the course intro. Kalen, for his part, wants none of the recognition. When asked if he'd like to speak at a student leadership event, he politely declines. "I didn't do anything," he tells his father one night while brushing his teeth. Dorian replies, "You stayed steady when others didn't. That's more than most ever learn how to do." Time passes. Then one morning, weeks after the storm, Dorian and Kalen arrive at the airport together. It's early, the sun barely rising over the terminal's curved roof. They move through security easily. At Gate 12, an attendant greets them with a kind smile, scans the boarding passes, and gestures to a seating area with care. Every staff member is calm, clear, and courteous.
No stares. No skepticism.
Just respect. As the boarding call is made, Dorian gently taps Kalen's shoulder. "Ready?" Kalen nods. "Yeah, this time feels different." And it does. The flight crew offers a nod. The staff opens the doors with precision and politeness. No one questions his seat. No one doubts his right to be there. As they step onto the jet bridge, Dorian glances back once. The terminal is quiet. No phones recording.
No arguments.
Just order. Somewhere, far away from Gate 47, a system has started healing. Some moments change a trip, but the right ones change the rules. He tried to intimidate a child, and went silent when the father stepped forward, credentials in hand. If you believe justice speaks softly but lands loudly, subscribe now. Because truth always takes the captain's seat. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights racism, bias, and the sudden shift that happens when prejudice is confronted by truth and authority. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and treating every person with dignity and respect.